So this right here, my friends, is the high quality 13-year-old cinema camera. It's in the CineAlta range, the PMW F5. Now, I actually bought this probably about 2 months ago right now, and I've actually used it on a couple of different shoots, and I'm actually really blown away of the image quality that you still get out of this camera. Now, this is 13 years old. November 2012 is when they actually released this thing. And, you know, 2025 this year, it's just absolutely incredible. And I want to show you the image quality of this thing and how it actually stands up against cameras nowadays. So the Sony PMW F5 is a digital cinema camera within the CineAlta range. It features an 8.9 megapixel Super 35 image sensor capable of capturing 4K footage internally or 4K external RAW into the AXS R5 recorder. It has a rated 14 stops of dynamic range. It has the old FZ mount, but has a PL mount adapter included in the initial purchase. It has a DVF EL100 OLED electronic viewfinder with a resolution of 1280 by 720. It has one HDMI output, 4 SDI outputs, 2 XLR inputs, 1 1/4-inch TRS stereo output, one 3.5 headphone jack in, a BNC timecode input, a mini USB, a USB-A, a high-res 8-pin control input, an XLR 4-pin power output, an XLR 4-pin power input, can be powered through V-mount battery, and the body alone weighs a total of 2.2 kilos or 4.9 pounds. But anyway, let's talk about the video recording codecs on this camera. Now, considering the sensor is about 12 to 13 years old right now, it was still able to do 4K at 50 or 60 frames per second in that Super 35 mode. And I mean, at that time, the only cameras were able to do that were these kind of cinema cameras, and that's why it does wear the badge of the CineAlta range. And one of the big things about this image quality is that you can actually shoot in Cine EI and have the modern flexibility of that exact same codec. You can see here that the image quality just looks incredible. Now, this is compressed through YouTube, but on my 4K monitor, it is just absolutely pristine when it comes to this image quality. We will talk about the dynamic range because it's not as strong as some of the cameras these days, but wow, the image quality is phenomenal with 4K at 25 frames per second. Now, if we are talking about 4K 50 frames per second, it is so close to the Sony FX6 that it is not funny. And being a camera that's pretty much 10 years younger than the FX6, it's pretty phenomenal how the image quality just stands up, you know, with the 25 and 50 frames per second in 4K internal. And obviously I do have to mention that the F5 is a Super 35 sensor compared to the Sony FX6's full frame sensor. So this would be almost comparable to, say, the new Sony FX30. Now, if we are to place the F5 against the FX30 in 50 frames per second with 4K, you can see the F5 holds up extremely well next to it. It almost looks identical. The image quality is that good. Obviously, the colors will be different between the models, but still, for such an old camera, this holds up incredibly well, considering it's only 8.9 megapixels with this 4K against the higher downsampled sensor of the FX30. And now when it comes to the colors of this, I am filming in Cine EI, but I was also able to utilize the S-Gamut 3.Cine color profile, which is pretty much standard in most modern Sony mirrorless cameras, and the colors look pretty phenomenal. Like if you put a Rec. 709 conversion light directly on top and then a little bit of a grade, it is very easy to utilize. It pretty much seems like the modern day mirrorless cameras, but this is over 12 years old, which is just absolutely insane of what you can achieve out of a camera this old. Now, impressively enough, you are able to record RGB 444 internally, but it is only at 2K resolution, so you can't do 4K at that RGB 444. You have to go down to 422 to be able to get 4K internally into the F5. But if you are recording directly into that R5 recorder, you're able to get 444 16-bit linear RAW, which is going to give you so much more flexibility with your colors and dynamic range. Now, this actually records the XOCN RAW codec that you pretty much get out of the Sony Venice and the Burano cameras. And you still actually have the ability to record RAW internally directly into this. So that gives you 16-bit linear RAW. So it's not just your 12-bit RAW that you get in most cameras when it comes to ProRes RAW. This is 16-bit XOCN. So it's a pretty incredible codec. But the one caveat for me is that I don't actually have the memory cards in this, so I will actually display that in another video that we're going to be talking about this camera, because this camera, I'm going to give it a whole bunch of new life when it comes to filming all my modern day stuff. Now look at the size of the AXSM reader. This thing is huge in comparison. The CF Express Type A card reader. Now look at the size difference. That is insane. Now, one minor caveat is that the base ISO on the F5 is ISO 2000. And if you are comparing to the FX30, the base ISO there is ISO 800. So automatically in a lot of situations, we'll have to utilize that inbuilt ND filter in the F5 to bring that ISO level down. Now, in terms of noise performance, the F5 isn't exactly a low light beast like the FX6, but it's very similar to the FX30 when it comes to the noise performance and patterns. Maybe the FX30 is just a touch cleaner than the F5, but if you are lighting your situations, you're going to get a very similar image across the board because both cameras are around 14 stops of dynamic range. So one thing I find quite interesting with this ISO level is that it is actually really clean at nighttime. ISO 2000 seems to be a really good level to use pretty much with basic standard lights at nighttime. And the grain on this thing is relatively small. It seems to be quite natural. It actually does perform pretty decent in low light situations, which is pretty baffling. So this is the difference between the two base levels in the F5 and the FX30. So you've got ISO 2000 and ISO 800. You can see obviously how much the levels are brought up in the F5, which would potentially make this particular scene quite clean because this is a dark studio with just a backlight. So there are pros and cons when it comes to the ISO being so high, because when it is daylight, you do have to utilize the internal ND filters to bring the levels down. But this could actually suit a lot of people who actually like having slightly higher ISO levels in certain situations. Now the great thing is that this actually has two types of ND filters. It's got a 0.9 stop and a 1.8 stop of ND. So they are hard stops. When it comes to my FX6, this is where we get a variable ND filter, but you also do have hard stops as well. But it is really nice that they do have a 0.9 and a 1.8 hard stop on here. But I do recommend, use a matte box and an ND filter system on the front, or if you do have some nice cinema lenses, you can just use a variable ND filter on the front as well. Now also the readout speed in this thing isn't great. It's not amazing. When it comes to the Sony FX6, it's about 8.7 milliseconds in 25 frames per second with 4K. This one, it's hard to say what it is. It actually seems pretty identical to the S1R2 when it comes to the 8K with the rolling shutter performance, which is roughly around that 24 milliseconds. It's really hard to say. This is just completely guessing with the evidence that I've got here. But when it comes to rolling shutter performance, I'm not really into the whole bad rolling shutter performance because it really depends on obviously the storytelling and really just focusing in on what the actual story is and not what the camera is actually doing when it comes to the jello effect. Now I can understand that it could be a little bit distracting if it is pretty bad, but in my opinion, this is perfectly fine for almost all use cases. Now, we got to talk about 1080p because 1080p was pretty much the standard when it came to, 2012, 2013. 4K was kind of just breaking in, but the 1080p in this camera is pretty phenomenal. Look at the image right here. I believe the 1080p is downsampled from the 4K sensor, so it actually looks quite clean and really good resolution. And even 1080p at 50 frames per second, it looks great. If you actually put this side by side with most modern day mirrorless cameras, it will still hold up extremely well with this 1080p codec. And still for a lot of my client projects, I actually export in 1080p. So one of the biggest things that a lot of people didn't like about this was the actual size of the camera itself. Now it is a relatively big camera in comparison if you are comparing it to my FX6. This is pretty big and it's pretty heavy, but for me and my kind of uses, I love handheld stuff and shooting from the hip. So when it comes to my sports action, shooting from the hip works perfectly fine, and a heavier camera actually is more beneficial in my situations because I actually like to have, smooth smooth, no micro jitters, but nice natural movement when it comes to handheld stuff. You know, if I did throw this on an easy rig, I would still have relatively natural movement, but having the weight in my hands, I just feel like there's much more control, and then I can still get really nice, intimate action stuff and not being too steady. But as we know, form factor really is subjective. It really comes down to how you shoot and how you prefer to hold the camera. But this definitely does suit my workflow. Now, if you do have the R5 recorder on the back, this does make it a lot thicker, more longer, and it does throw the center of gravity out. It really depends on what lenses you're using as well, if you're using large, heavy cinema lenses. But this is where you just need to rig it out to your best use case. And if you're not using handheld, then this should be perfectly fine. But if you're a handheld user, it just depends if you like it heavy or light. Yeah, it's just subjective. Now, one thing that we are blessed with this camera body happens to come down to the 2 XLR inputs directly on the body. Now, in terms of where this is actually situated, I actually don't like it at all because it pokes out the side directly onto the side. It doesn't come out on an angle, but you know, hey, it still has XLR that you can go directly into the body itself, whereas my FX6 has no XLR on the body. It's only on the top handle. And when it comes to all the other I/O ports, we've got a whole bunch on this side. Now, one major feature about the design of this is the Big 6. It's the screen on the side that you generally see in the Venice cameras and also the RE cinema cameras as well. So you can access all the information on this side, which is really incredible. Now, when it comes to the memory cards, we are using the old S/S Pro cards. Now, these cards are pretty ancient and you do need these specific readers for that, but what you can actually do is just turn the camera on and connect it directly to your computer, and you can actually transfer it straight off the camera itself. Now, one thing that does suit my workflow happens to come down to that V-mount battery. So at the back here, you do have the V-mount battery plate, and I've got a whole bunch of V-mount batteries that fit directly on here. And in terms of how power hungry this is, I mean, it's not too bad at all. You could leave this on and still use a 99 watt-hour battery for pretty much a whole CrossFit shoot. So, you know, 1.5 to 2 hours of filming, you'll still have plenty of battery power through that 99 watt-hour battery. So look, overall, this camera is still pretty incredible considering that it's 2025 and this was made in 2012. It still holds value. It still has an incredible image quality. Obviously, if you do light the scenes, that's going to be far more beneficial than just run and gun because, you know, it does lack dynamic range. It does lack the readout speeds. It does lack the frame rates. Like, you still get that high quality 4K footage. The colors in this is still perfectly fine, and I absolutely love it, but you will definitely see another video on the PMW F5 camera. This thing is just a beast, and in 2025, I'm super happy with this camera. But thanks for watching, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.